You probably didn't expect to hear this. Hospitals across France are being told to quietly prepare for war. And not just any war. They've been instructed to get ready for wounded NATO soldiers, possibly arriving as soon as 2026. Surgeons are being trained in battlefield trauma, supplies are being stockpiled, and French officials have even published a survival guide for civilians. It's the first time since World War II that the French state has openly prepared its own population for the possibility of mass casualties in a European war. The message is unmistakable. Paris doesn't think this is some distant theory. They think war with Russia is now a real possibility. And why now? What does it mean for NATO? Let's break it down. When most people think about the war in Europe today, they think about Ukraine. But for France, this is about something bigger. Officials aren't just preparing for the current conflict to drag on. They're preparing for the chance that Russia directly attacks NATO. And under Article 5, the core promise of NATO, that means every member, including France, Britain, Germany, and the United States, would be pulled in immediately. That's why French hospitals aren't just planning for domestic needs. They're preparing for waves of foreign soldiers too. Think about what that signals. France doesn't just expect to fight. It expects to be a hub for treating wounded NATO troops in a large-scale war. And France isn't alone. Across Europe, the shift is undeniable. Britain has been rebuilding parts of its military structure. Norway has reopened Cold War-era bunkers. Poland is massively expanding its armed forces. The Baltic states are running nationwide training drills, teaching ordinary citizens how to respond in the event of a Russian incursion. It's as if the entire continent has started planning for something unthinkable just a few years ago, a NATO-Russia war. The price tag for such a war? Staggering. Analysts estimate that a NATO-Russia conflict could cost upwards of $1.5 trillion in the first year alone. That's before even accounting long-term destruction, refugee crises, and infrastructure collapse. Economically, it would make the First and Second World Wars look almost small by comparison. But for France, this isn't about the numbers. It's about readiness. French leaders are sending a clear signal to Moscow. If Russia escalates, NATO will not be caught off guard. To understand why tensions are this high, you have to rewind. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 wasn't only about Ukraine. From the beginning, Vladimir Putin made it clear his real issue was NATO expansion. Since the Cold War ended, NATO has moved steadily closer to Russia's borders. And for Moscow, that's not just politics, it's survival. NATO's collective defense rule, Article 5, means if one member is attacked, all respond. So if NATO sits directly on Russia's doorstep, the Kremlin sees it as an existential threat. That's why Finland joining NATO in 2023 and Sweden following in 2024 were such major blows to Russia. Overnight, NATO gained control of the Baltic Sea. Moscow suddenly faced the reality of being surrounded by NATO allies on multiple sides. What NATO saw as defensive expansion, Russia saw as encirclement and humiliation. And for Putin, the goal has never simply been about protecting Russia's borders. It's been about restoring the old Russian Empire, reclaiming influence across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even parts of the Arctic. That ambition is backed by hard power. Russia has poured money into rebuilding its military. Its defense budget has soared. The army is expanding towards 1.5 million active troops. Conscription has been widened, with young men across Russia being swept into service. And reports suggest Russia has even recruited North Korean soldiers to bolster its manpower. On top of that, Russia is reviving missile programs. New solid propellant systems are being prepared, capable of striking both nearby European targets and longer-range adversaries. In short, Moscow is preparing not just to sustain the current war in Ukraine, but to fight a broader conflict if it comes to that. And Russia isn't doing it alone. Behind the scenes, a new axis of power has quietly formed. Russia has drawn closer to China, Iran, and North Korea. China supplies the technology and critical nuclear materials. Iran provides drones and missile systems, weapons that have already been seen on the battlefield in Ukraine. North Korea, meanwhile, sends artillery shells by the hundreds of thousands, along with manpower that Moscow desperately needs. For decades, American strategists warned about this exact coalition. Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the most influential U.S. foreign policy thinkers, once said the greatest danger for the West would be a united China-Russian-Iran front. Today, that warning looks more like reality than theory. So how is NATO responding? With its own buildup. The United States has stationed more than 100,000 troops across Europe. Poland is constructing the largest land army on the continent. Germany has dusted off old conscription frameworks. France plans to double its reserve forces by 2035. And across the European Union, governments are urging citizens to stockpile basic supplies, from food to batteries, just in case. These aren't small symbolic gestures. They're the kind of moves that only happen when governments believe the risk of war is serious. That brings us back to France. Why the timeline of 2026? Military analysts suggest that by then, Russia could recover much of the strength it's lost in Ukraine. Its factories are running non-stop, churning out weapons and ammunition. Its recruitment drives have kept manpower flowing. By 2026 or 2027, Moscow may be ready to challenge NATO directly. And there's another marker, Zapad 2025. That's the massive military exercise Russia runs every few years along NATO's borders. These drills aren't just for training, they're often used for cover for mobilization. Some officials worry that Zapad 2025 could be the staging ground for a sudden strike. France's government seems to be reading the same signals, preparing hospitals, training doctors, drafting civilian guides. It all points to one conclusion. Paris doesn't think this is just theoretical anymore. They think the window for peace may be closing fast. Diplomacy, of course, hasn't been abandoned. Over the years, attempts at negotiation have come from Washington, from Riyadh, even from the United Nations, but each round has collapsed. Talks in Alaska ended with Moscow walking away. Later efforts by Trump and Putin himself failed to produce lasting results. The pattern is consistent. Negotiations break down, and Russia escalates further. That's why so many in Europe now believe the diplomatic track is effectively exhausted. What's left is preparation. And this is the heart of the dilemma. If Russia attacks even a small NATO country, say Estonia or Latvia, Article 5 automatically triggers. That means France, Britain, Germany, the US, and more than 24 other nations are instantly at war with Russia. There's no halfway option. So, when France prepares its hospitals and issues survival guides for its civilians, it's not because leaders want people to panic. It's because they know the stakes. If NATO and Russia collide, there's no limited fight. It would be the biggest war Europe has seen since 1945. France isn't saying war is inevitable, but its actions reveal something important. For the first time in decades, a major European power is planning for the possibility of full-scale conflict with Russia. And that raises a chilling question. Are we watching the early steps of a continent preparing for peace through strength, or the countdown to the unthinkable?